What do you think about Prime Minister Netanyahu implementing Amalek in his discussion?
Oh, did he do that?
Oh, yeah, a couple of times.
I didn't hear that.
It's very interesting.
Yeah.
He just, as an anti-Nazi thing, he did that about 10, 12, 15 years ago. And more recently in the situation. It's kind of an interesting.
It is interesting. I had thinking about it. It's too soon for me because the Torah says wipe out Amalek. And we do have to find a way to get along with these people. Of course, they have to come partly our direction. But if they're enemy forever,
That makes it difficult. Oh, excuse me. Oh, okay. All right. It's an interesting.
it is, but it's too mythic for me. It creates the Palestinians as a mythic entity never going to reconcile. And it's my view it's in one's self-interest. No love.
Two states. I still think the two-state system has to be the
And I think Saudi Arabia is
I haven't seen the movie.
He keeps getting reelected. Even if it's a small margin. Siege.
Good morning, everybody. Shabbat Shalom. Nice to see everybody. Let me begin by thanking people, Candy Anchor for sponsoring the bagels, and Carol Marshall for sponsoring the live stream. Thank you. And Sue and Bob Curtis for picking up the bagels. I don't see Sue. Was she kind of the guiding spirit behind your picking it up? So she did her part. Good. Okay. Very good. Okay. So let's continue with our blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot b'divrei Torah. We praise you, Lord our God, sovereign of the universe, who sanctifies us through God's commandments, enjoining upon us the obligation to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Amen. Okay, so we are thinking about the issue of sibling rivalry now, which has many, many manifestations in the Tanakh. As I indicated here on this sheet, I forgot to bring more, but we don't really need to go over it again quickly. But we're doing Cain and Abel. We'll move then to Jacob and Esau, which is a complicated story. And then we'll do something with Joseph and his brothers without going through the whole thing. We just want to see how the relationship between Joseph and his brothers falls apart and how it's put back together again. I don't think that's too hyperbolic a statement to feel that the relationship is healed. We may feel that it's still fragile, but they do find a way to come back together again. And we'll want to look at both what makes it fall apart and what is it that allows it to come back together. We're going to face that too at Jacob and Esau. There is some kind of a reconciliation at the end of the story. It happens abruptly, and we may have reason to doubt its durability. But at least we're going to look at mechanisms. I suppose that's one of the things we're looking at. What are the causal factors of making relationships among siblings fragile and fall apart? And what are the antidotes? What are the causes which can bring it back together again? Jackie, do you have a question?
Yeah, one of our Torah mates last week brought up a question, and I think I'm just going to state it for her. Regarding Cain and Abel, if both people gave offerings that come from their heart,
Yeah.
I think that's the way you mentioned it, what makes one gift better than the other?
Well, it's an interesting point. Why don't we hold that for a second and go back to the story and take that up as we're reviewing it. So the first thing to notice, I think, is something that Leon Cass says, that what we have here is the first family in history, and that history, I'm making a distinction between, just to say it overly generally, we make a distinction between eternity and history, timelessness and time. In the Garden of Eden, there is timelessness, the possibility of living forever, which of course Adam and Eve blow and therefore force their expulsion. So when we leave the Garden of Eden, we're now in the process of time, one moment after another. And the very first episode features a family. So that not only is the family the first institution, I'm just citing Cass here, the first institution in history, but it features a variety of relationships. And therefore, by studying that first family, the Torah exposes relationships between husbands and wives, parents and children, children to each other. So it strikes me as important that the very first story features society's fundamental and problematic institution, the family. It's not only problematic, it has felicitous qualities and possibilities of health and peace, but the Torah is, I think, surgical in its unpacking what causes this family to fall apart in terms of its elementary relationships. So let's just remind ourselves of the story here in chapter 4 of Genesis, and then I will try to say something by way of review and see if we have some conversation to have about it, and then we'll move to Jacob and Esau. Chapter 4 of Genesis. Now the man knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gained a male child with the help of the Lord. We remember one alternative reading of this, which I think is faithful to the Hebrew, as I have gained a child equally with the Lord. I have gained a child, and therefore my value, potency, is equal to the Lord. Here, if we accept that translation, she is boasting. She then bore his brother Abel. Okay? So Cain's name has an etymology. I have purchased Cain from kaniti, to gain, to buy, to make. whereas Abel's name has no etymology, but there is a connection between his name, Hevel, and the beginning of the book of Ecclesiastes. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. The Hebrew, Hevel, Abel's name is Hevel. You can see it if you have the Hebrew. And she again bore, verse 2, his brother at Havel. Havel is just a certain form of Hevel called a pausal form. It slows, it's like a retard in music. It slows the process down. Okay? So, Ecclesiastes. Hevel Havalim, vanity of vanities. Havel Havalim, vanity of vanities. Hakol Havel. Everything is vanity. An alternative translation for Hevel is breath or vapor. Vapor of vapors, all is vapor. Vapor is a something which quickly disappears. It's fragile, it's evanescent. And so without giving an etymology in the text, we could make an inference that this is what the author may have had in mind by giving Abel the name Abel. Okay? Abel became a keeper of sheep, and Cain became a tiller of the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought an offering to the Lord from the fruit of the soil, and Abel, for his part, brought the choicest of the firstlings of his flock. The Lord paid heed to Abel and his offering, but to Cain and his offering he paid no heed. Cain was much distressed, and his face fell. And the Lord said to Cain, why are you distressed, and why is your face fallen? Surely if you do right, there is uplift. Difficult Hebrew. But if you do not do right, sin couches at the door. Its urge is toward you, and you can be its master. Cain said to his brother Abel, and then the Torah has a gap there. It doesn't say what he said. Cain said to his brother Abel, in my translation, ... maybe in yours too. And when they were in the field, Cain set upon his brother Abel and killed him. And the Lord said to Cain, where is your brother Abel? And he said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? Okay, so that's the story. Now, we do have a consequence, but we're not really dealing now with the consequence. So here's a summary of what I think we discovered last week, and then we'll see whether you agree with these, whether there's more. First of all, parental pride in the opening of the womb. Okay? So that the firstborn is not only a child, but I might say symbolic of the fertility of the woman and the man. Okay? So that firstborn affirms something very powerful about the parents. And therefore, the firstborn has a status, not only by being first, but by demonstrating attributes of the parents that subsequent born children do not show. Okay? So there is a kind of primacy of the firstborn, irrespective of the character, the personality, the activities of that child. Let me put it this way. There is an inherent structural primacy of the firstborn, and not simply an empirical demonstration. In other words, if the firstborn child just happens to be a child who warms the heart of his or her parents, and therefore becomes, let's say, favored, loved, because of who he and she is as a person, that's very different from what I'm calling structural primacy. The very fact of being the firstborn creates a kind of primacy which is going to have implications in the family. Let me go on just a little bit. After all, now, let me just say one more thing. That the mandate to human beings in Genesis chapter 1 is to be fruitful and multiply. And to be able to do that is the fulfillment of the first commandment, and a big deal. That's the point I'm making. So that child is inherently favored, let me just say, a priori, from the beginning, which favor can be compromised, undermined, by how that child turns out to be. Okay? There is, therefore, inherent jealousy on the part of the secondborn toward the firstborn. But also, that would be Abel's jealousy of Cain. But also there's Cain's jealousy of Abel because his sacrifice is desirable and Cain's less so. Now, why is it that his sacrifice is more desirable? Because he brought the best of his, what does it say here? From the choicest of the firstlings of his flock. Okay? So what are we to make of this? Either the bare fact that his offering is the more accepted, and that creates a jealousy, or the fact that he brings the choicest of his flock may have something to do with character, with motivation. Abel understands the nature of sacrifice. The nature of sacrifice is not to give your worst sheep, but your best sheep. Because you're sacrificing out of, well, we might say obligation, but in terms of an emotion, out of gratitude for what you've been given. It suggests that you recognize that what you have is not created by you, but a gift to you. And therefore, it puts you in the debt of the giver. And you repay that debt by offering a sacrifice. And Abel evidently gets the point of sacrifice, whereas the same thing is not said about Cain. So, the reason I'm suggesting this is that Cain's anger and jealousy may have a background for which these two offerings are only the most recent manifestation. We could infer something about Abel's character and personality, and maybe he is therefore more beloved by the parents because he is the kind of person. So this is wildly speculative, but based on something that is happening in the text. So to Jackie's question, why is his offering favored? Here's my answer. I don't know. God plays favorites here, unless you think that there is some rationale to why Abel's is accepted and Cain's is not. And it's the rationale that I've been driving at, that perhaps these are two different kinds of people, and therefore Abel's sacrifice is going to be, given who he is, his attributes, more accepted than Cain's. I think there's another point here too, though. How siblings, brothers and sisters are regarded has something to do with the differences between them. And that a parent, for no good reason, may favor one over the other. There's a kind of, I was going to say irrationality to it, but also there's a rationality to it as well. Maybe it's a problematic one, but if a parent loves basketball and has two kids, one of whom also loves basketball and the other doesn't, to that degree, I'm not saying overall, the basketball player is favored. If you say to the parent, why are you favoring this child? The parent may be stunned about that. I'm not trying to. It's just natural. We have something in common. And therefore, the difference in the impact of their two sacrifices may point to the way in which impact in a family now is also impacted by parental interests. Do they correspond, and to what degree, with the interests of the children? And that creates asymmetries and therefore anger, jealousy within the family. I'm trying to make something out of this question that Jackie raised. Ellen?
Well, don't forget, Adam and Eve were born in total innocence before they ate from the tree of knowledge.
Yeah.
So, first of all, they must have been shocked that they had a baby, not knowing what it was going to produce. But also, maybe Cain didn't know that death is death.
Yeah, that's right. That's an interesting point, because he is punished for killing his brother. And the text itself gives us no indication that he was told or instructed about don't murder. And one possible inference from this, and I think it's a powerful inference myself, is the idea of natural law, of conscience, that we're born with something of a sense, however primitive, of the difference between right and wrong. One almost has to say that, otherwise the punishment of Cain becomes irrational. If Cain's punishment is rational, now look, there's a difference here. We have to notice the difference between Cain's experience and our experience of Cain. We know that murder is wrong, and therefore we might pass over the problem by saying, well, we take it for granted. But we have to recognize that Cain doesn't have the knowledge about this that we do. So if the punishment is not to be irrational, then Cain must be attributed a knowledge that murder is wrong. Jim?
But if you go back where it says Eve has the child with the help of the Lord, and then you perceive that the sons are trying to get the acknowledgement of the Lord, not their parents. So I understand it's all a story and all that, but there's...
It's not just a story, it's the story.
Okay.
Isn't it?
But my point is, where did they get this notion that there's a higher being that they're trying to get favor from? And they totally skip over getting appreciation from their parents. Unless I missed a sentence here, they skipped over. And we're saying that the sibling rivalry emanates from favoritism.
Right.
Sometimes it's the two people just don't get along or whatever. But what are we to make of that Cain and Abel are looking for some kind of appreciation from the Lord? Where did they get this notion of a higher being? I mean, they don't know anything. They're totally innocent, and all of a sudden they're competing to an abstract something they don't... Where did they get that from?
Right. It's a good question for which I have no good answer, except I don't know if you'll accept this, but an author of a story can't account for every possible detail and assumption that the story makes. In other words, the author could have paused to say something about there is a God, maybe a little backstory, that they had some experience with God, or that their parents told them that there's a God, or the notion here of sacrificing implies something that you are wondering about, that there is a being to whom a sacrifice ought to be made. So I have two answers to your question. One is, I have no idea. And the second is, let's have a little pity for the author who can't fill in all the blanks at the end. So I suppose there's a third thing to say, and that is, how should I say this? The author seems to be presupposing that we're going to bring something to our reading, and that we're going to bring to our reading the idea that either we believe in this entity, or that it's plausible, given the overall interest of the author, it's plausible to assume it. Otherwise, there's no story of discovery here.
Well, that's what I'm suggesting, that this is a very subtle way of monotheism. It's telling you there is somebody else or something else in charge over and above your parents and yourself and everything else.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point. Here's what I think. Here's what I make of your point: that the author always has the reader in mind, and the author is trying to educate the reader without saying, "Dear reader, there is a God." The author presumes the existence of God so that the reader can presume it as well. And perhaps, okay, so it's part of the artistry of the author. Right. What can I assume in my desire to enlighten the reader? I think that is what's happening. Maida?
I find it very disturbing that they can just blatantly say, and God favored this but didn't favor that, didn't pay no heed to it. What did he do that showed that difference? I mean, don't you want to know how God supposedly reacted to each?
What did one of the three children do to have parents favor the other two, or for there to be some asymmetry in a family? I mean, there is such a thing as irrational favoritism.
But what did he do? How did he show that favoritism? It doesn't say. I mean, it leaves us totally... So he thought this was a wonderful one, and he paid no heed to this one.
Well, yeah, at the end of verse 4, the Lord paid heed to Abel and his offering, but to Cain and his offering paid no heed. There's irrationality, isn't there? We tend to accord authority to taller than shorter people. If a person is born extremely handsome or extremely beautiful, they have a leg up on their lives, don't they?
Yes.
This seems unfair, but we do know that it operates, right? So that in a way, that favoritism for no good reason, well, there is a good reason here, but the idea of favoritism, even by God, has a realistic component to it. That certain endowments that some people have and some people don't have makes them favored. Easier in life to make it through life if you have certain kinds of attributes. Hard to say it, but isn't it true? Okay. So, Russell?
So I'd like to put forth that perhaps the reason God favored one over the other was he wanted or needed to teach a life lesson.
He what now?
He have a life lesson, a teaching moment to Cain. Because he accepted one, he rejected the other. Cain felt bad about it, and God addressed it.
Yeah.
And he says, why are you mad? And he says, surely if you do it right, there's an uplift. He's giving him, and he says, and then sin couches around and you can master it. And what happens next? Cain kills his brother, you know? And what happens next? God punishes him. And Cain feels bad, so he learns something. But more importantly, the author is giving us that life lesson. So I think that's my thought of how it's structured.
That's an interesting point. Once again, the author is reaching beyond the story to the reader. Not just telling a story, but telling it to somebody, right? Temptation, we can rule over it. Yeah. Am I my brother's keeper? For Cain, the answer is no. For us, the answer is yes. It's pointing to yes. Yes, you are. So I think it's a good point. Amy?
Well, maybe Cain is trying to not so much get rid of Abel as the idea that once Abel was born, there's a point of comparison. And when the first kid is always, you should excuse the expression, Jesus. So, but then when there's another kid, there's somebody else and maybe what he's trying to do is get rid of that. And by being punished, we're kind of being taught that this is part of life. You are always going to be in a group, and somebody's going to come out in one set of values, somebody's judgment, and somebody is going to be lesser. So maybe it wasn't personal in the sense of, that he didn't like him. It's just he wanted to get that annoyance of being compared out of the way.
I'm not following you. I thought you were saying that one of the points here is that life is unfair and it's going to deal out the cards unequally. What was your last point in terms of Cain getting Abel out of the way?
That he mistakenly thought that he was not going to have the problem of being compared to other people if he got rid of this, because at that point I think there's only the parents and the two of them.
So in other words, Cain doesn't learn the lesson that life is unfair, and he tries to compensate for that.
He tries to make it work in so he tries to control the universe.
Yeah, that's a good point actually, because when you compare this story to Jacob and Esau, or Joseph and his brothers, they don't, well, Joseph and his brothers, yes, but there is reconciliation at the end for both, which suggests that those stories, we'll have to see once we get there, are educating the players and us that life is unfair in terms of the distribution of goods, but we can still make it by recognizing and not allowing that, because the brothers finally accept Joseph and he them. So Cain doesn't learn the lesson that I think the Torah may be wanting to tell us. Bennett?
Yeah, I view this a little differently. This is the first sacrifice. We don't have Leviticus to tell us how to make sacrifices. And it's interesting to me that the parents didn't give a sacrifice in thanks for bearing children. But this was set up as a dual sacrifice, so that you have two people giving a sacrifice. And God can compare the two and say, one is the right way and one is not suitable for me. And the consequences of God doing that, he didn't realize. And the jealousy was set up because of God, the way God handled the sacrifice. So
Bennett's point is that well, maybe this isn't the way you would formulate it, that sacrifice comes naturally to them. They're not instructed to sacrifice.
Or God made, naturally, because God kind of in the birth of them, they naturally, okay, I would, naturally is a good way to express it. But they didn't know the proper way to do it that would satisfy God.
Right. So, I think there are two
And
things.
God is trying to say, okay, I appreciate your giving sacrifices, but you really should take the best, not just any sacrifice.
Right. So I think there are two things. One is that sacrifice, or a form of the religious life, comes naturally. They don't have to be told that you should sacrifice. This emerges from their situation. They, just to expand on what isn't expressed, they're given gifts, they say thank you. So I think one of the things that Torah is trying to express here is that religion comes naturally to human beings. Now, what kind of religion, how it's expressed, still needs to be described. The second is, what your point, there's a right way and a wrong way. And so there's a difference between well-motivated sacrifice and perfunctory sacrifice, just to say it like that. And Abel gets it right that, as the Torah says that proper worship is avodah shebalev, the offering or the service of the heart. Maimonides says that means prayer. Okay? But short of one way of understanding that, there seems to be in the Torah this notion that prayer has to involve service of the heart, not just of the hands or the material object, that motivation matters. And that's part of what's being said there. Vivian?
Well, you really want to know what happens between those dots. But one of the things about reading revisiting these stories every year, all over and over again, you always see something different. And this, to me, looks like a perfect parallel to Eden, insofar as we pay attention to the very few dialogues between God and characters. And Cain here is the intimate.
Cain here's what?
Cain is the intimate with God.
Uh-huh.
Cain is spoken to, and there's a long dialogue and instructions here. And then immediately after he kills Abel,
Yes.
jump to 9, the Lord said to Cain, where is your brother? And that's the line that resonates out of this story.
Okay.
It is not so much to me about sacrifice as about choice.
Oh.
As the tree of knowledge was a choice, so is Cain's choice to act. And he's given the choice there in the Lord's admonition that what's your problem?
Yeah.
I think it's just an amazing interplay. And again, I read this as Cain is the intimate of God in this story.
Yeah, that's a good point.
He's wrong, but then he's also protected to wander the earth.
That's
So
an
what's
excellent
that
point.
about? As we all are wondering still. So it's just, I think it's just a really powerful play of what's going on.
That's very nice. It reminds me of something that happens in the book of Job. Job throughout the book continues to ask God for a response. He wants to bring God to trial. And one of the ways of understanding what the outcome is of that book is that finally God does speak to Job. And what God says may not be powerful to the reader, but the very fact of being addressed already raises Job's dignity. And you're saying that here about this story too, so that, I like that, so that though Cain seems to be the lesser of the two children in this story, I think what Vivian is suggesting is that, I don't know if you'll accept this formulation, he is redeemed at the end by being addressed.
Right. I mean, we always take him as the villain, but
Yeah.
it's interesting because he's tortured forever, or he is legendary as Adam and Eve. He is beyond the story. He
Right.
lives
Although
past
God,
that.
God protects him, puts a mark on his forehead, he builds the
Even
first
that,
city, I think, and so on. So he turns out to have some redeeming qualities. But, okay, so sacrifice is a motif here, choice is a motif, and as you point out, a big, powerful motif in the Garden of Eden story. So the Torah is also exploring not just family dynamics, but what it means to be a human being. To be a human being means to have some autonomy and free choice for which one can be held responsible. And just to say it again, I mean, one of the things that interests me about all of these early stories is that they are pointing to Mount Sinai. There's free choice without instruction. There's punishment without forewarning about it. One of the things that I think these story shows is the need for Sinai. So that, just to say it more dramatically, the whole point, now the whole point is overstated. One of the points of these stories is to point to the need for something else, something more. First of all, the covenant with Abraham and Abraham's family, and then the covenant at Mount Sinai with the people, which finally solves the question, how do I know what to do? And that is all of the commandments and forms of ritual, which become normative and not just up to us untutored human beings to try to figure it out. Okay, Doris?
Well, one of the things that interests me is the end of the story that you just read. Because Cain commits a murder, and God punishes him by saying, you're even lower than the earth, and whatever you try to grow, it's not going to grow. And then Cain comes back and negotiates a lesser punishment. And for murder. And God says, oh, okay, I'll lessen your punishment. And I think, why didn't Adam and Eve do some negotiation? So, no, and I don't mean that facetiously. I think there's an advance of consciousness here that you can negotiate with God. Because Adam and Eve could have said, could we come back at least on weekends? They accept their punishment. And Cain didn't. And you would think for murder, not for eating a piece of fruit, although it's disobedience, God would say, no, this is really serious.
So that's an interesting point, that there's punishment in both the Garden of Eden story and here, but Cain speaks up on his behalf the way Adam and Eve don't.
And God changes his mind.
I'm sorry?
And God changes his mind. God changes.
Right. Although, let me try to make a few points for God in the Garden of Eden story. Not that you're not. God decides actually to clothe them and to give them a way of managing in society. I might say, even before they asked, God's mercy. In other words, the dynamic in both stories is sin, justice, mercy. Adam and Eve sin, they're punished, but God clothes them and gives them a way forward. Here, Cain sins, punished, mercy, though the difference, as you point out, is that Cain enters into a conversation on his own behalf. But I think that structure is also interesting as well, because these stories are showing the importance of both justice and mercy. That justice may be warranted, but it can't be the last word. That there's compassion that is offered at the end of these stories. Malcolm.
I think it's interesting from my perspective to think about the amount of literary real estate that this story consumes.
Say that again now.
The relatively limited amount of literary real estate that this story consumes. So we've just spent an enormous amount of time learning about the creation of the world. And now we're introduced in fairly short order to 4 characters, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, and they're relatively undeveloped, immature, naive characters. And there's a lot of story yet to be told. So I think, it's appealing and interesting to conjecture, but just in terms of how much, there's a pretty simple story here. There are humans who have been created, and they're flawed. And we're just beginning to understand their relationship to God.
Yeah. So Malcolm's point is that this is a very spare story. We've made a lot out of it, but there's not a lot of detail there, as there will be later on. Though, yes, the details, the narrative elements are few, but they're potent, aren't they? Eve's reaction to having given birth, Cain's jealousy, that Cain is named and Abel is not, that Cain gets angry. These are paradigms, aren't they, of the way in which families can go wrong, and really the way in which all families go wrong. Look, there's a predisposition to favor the firstborn. Don't you think that's natural? We wonder whether or not we're able to carry a child to term, and whether the semen is potent enough to impregnate, fertilize an egg. Isn't that an anxiety we all have? And therefore, the celebration at the moment of birth, and that first child is the carrier of that celebration. So that can happen in an instant. I have gotten a child either with the help of the Lord or along with the Lord, is a very potent statement. So here's what I think I'd like to say. The spareness of the story, but the fact that every element in that spareness matters, is a sign of the genius of the author. The author tells a big story in a very, very small way. We've speculated about why God accepts Cain's and Abel's and not Cain's. So some of it is speculative, you're right. We are filling out the story. But don't you think, I guess another way to put it is, have we overdone this? Or, yes, in some ways our speculations may go beyond what the story allows us to say, at least in its concreteness. But the story itself it's like an atom, atom, which when bombarded yields an enormous amount of energy. And that's a sign of genius. Don't you think these stories in their evocation and their implications are much, much richer than we might originally have felt? Yeah. Okay, Candy?
I think the jealousy that Cain and Abel have come from the fact that, at least in the way my family works, is that Cain has inherited, being the firstborn, a lot of the parts of Adam that maybe are not good. The impetuousness, of choosing
Yeah.
a sacrifice, or the impetuousness of taking a bite of an apple. And that's why parents often favor one child over another. But it's also why disruption occurs. Sometimes a child will inherit the same stubbornness or bad traits that a parent has and make them like oil and water together, and they don't get along. And I think that that impetuousness that's implied plays a lot into the story.
Interesting point. The inheritance of acquired characteristics, we might put it that way, yeah. Yeah, families inherit and pass on good and not so
But
good.
like you say about the atom, it just makes the situation harder to understand and creates a lot of energy to throw that into it. But I think it has something to do with the way families work.
Right. Good. Okay, so why don't we just now make a quick transition to Jacob and Esau. So I'm going to read a passage from Cass, this very lovely book, The Beginning of Wisdom, reading Genesis. And for those who might like to know where I'm reading from page 405. And here's what Cass says by way of something of an introduction to Jacob. Even the most casual of readers finds Jacob and his story immediately engaging. The portrait drawn of him is richer and more complex than that of anyone else in Genesis, and his life, recounted in its entirety, occupies fully half of Genesis's 50 chapters, right? Genesis has 50 chapters. We're introduced to Jacob in chapter 25. So he is the dominant person in the book of Genesis. We readers witness, and now he's going to tell us what it is this story tells us. We readers witness his conception and birth, his early life, and his leaving home. We are present at his wedding, the birth of his children, the death of his beloved wife, and the disappearance of his favorite son. We accompany him to Egypt, behold his reunion with Joseph, hear his final blessings of his sons, attend his death, and participate vicariously in the long funeral procession that bears his body back from Egypt for burial in the Promised Land. We observe all of his struggles at home and abroad, with man and with God. We rejoice in his numerous triumphs and share in his abundant sorrows. We learn not only about Jacob's deeds and speeches, but also, and more than with Abraham and Isaac, about his inner life, his dreams, his thoughts, his feelings. Less heroic and austere than Abraham, more robust and enterprising than Isaac, Jacob strikes us immediately as more recognizable and familiar. In many respects, not all that different from ourselves. That's a lovely paragraph, isn't it? About all the detail we get about Jacob's life. And I suppose one way of thinking about it is that Jacob's name is changed to Israel, and Israel is the name of the people that comes from Jacob's loins, right? From his 12 sons come the 12 tribes, comes the people of Israel. And we see that transition from Genesis to Exodus. At the end of Genesis, it's 12 tribes. At the beginning of Exodus, it is now 12 tribes having become a people. And so maybe one of the reasons why Jacob is given so much attention is that he is Israel. We are Jacob, the author may want to be saying. But I love that paragraph. Let me go on just a little bit. Yet Jacob, though nearer to us, is no ordinary fellow. He is more than complicated. He is comprehensive. Jacob is first of all a man of uncommon cunning and cleverness, a man of many turns and many ways, the biblical counterpart of Odysseus. Like Odysseus, Jacob lives after the age of heroes. Odysseus after Achilles, Jacob after Abraham. Like Odysseus, he lives largely by his wits. Like Odysseus, he is made to travel far in order to learn the ways of men and God, and thereby earn the day of his homecoming. Though he is from time to time in touch with the divine, Jacob is mostly on his own, relying on his own powers and devices. Lovely summary, I think, of all that Jacob is. So let's turn to chapter 25, verse 19, which is the beginning of a Torah portion. Toldot. This is the story of Isaac, but Toldot is also a Hebrew word for history. This is the large story of Jacob. Let me read it, and then we'll talk about the sibling rivalry issue. This is the story of Isaac, the son of Abraham. Abraham begot Isaac. Isaac was 40 years old when he took to wife Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Padan Aram, sister of Laban, the Aramean. Isaac pleaded with the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren. And the Lord responded to his plea, and his wife Rebekah conceived. Just a little aside here. So here Isaac is like Cain, speaking up for himself and his need. But the children struggled in her womb, and she said, "If this is so, why do I exist?" She went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord answered her, "Two nations are in your womb. 2 separate people shall issue from your body. One people shall be mightier than the other, and the older shall serve the younger." When her time to give birth was at hand, there were twins in her womb. The first one emerged red, like a hairy mantle all over, so they named him Esau. Then his brother emerged, holding on to the heel of Esau, so they named him Yaakov. Isaac was 60 years old when they were born. When the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the outdoors, but Jacob was a mild man who stayed in camp. The rabbis add to this, studying Torah. I mean, you think Torah was only given at a certain moment in time? Torah has always existed. It's just written down at a certain time. Very fanciful, but powerful interpretation. Let me go back to the beginning of 27. When the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the outdoors, but Jacob was a mild man who stayed in camp. Isaac favored Esau because he had a taste for game, but Rebekah favored Jacob. Once when Jacob was cooking stew, Esau came in from the open, famished. Esau said to Jacob, "Give me some of that red stuff to gulp down, for I'm famished," which is why he was named Edom, the word for red. Jacob said, "First sell me your birthright." And Esau said, "I'm at the point of death, so what use is my birthright to me?" But Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore to him, and he sold his birthright to Jacob. Jacob then gave Esau bread and lentil stew. He ate and drank, he rose and went away. Thus did Esau spurn the birthright. Let me just read verse 34, the last verse in the Hebrew, because what we have in the Hebrew is a succession of 5 verbs, one after another, as if Esau's action is generated by a hunger, and he quickly moves to get that food and to eat it without any second thoughts or reflection. So even this repetition of the verbs in a kind of rapid-fire way tells us something, it seems to me, about who Esau was. So V'Yaakov natan le'esav lechem, gave to Esau bread, lechem, unazir adashim, and lentil stew. And here are the 5 verbs. Vayochal, vayesht, vayakam, vayelech, vayivez. Each of those is a verb. And he ate, and he drank, and he got up, and he went, and he spurned. Right after, one after another. Vayochal, vayesht, vayakam, vayelech, vayivez, Esav, et ha-bechorah. Spurned his birthright. So what are we learning here about the 2 boys and about their relationship? Jim?
They're 2 different people.
Could you describe their difference?
Good. It's described right in the story. One is a academic, and one is what you call it? Outdoorsman. An active person.
Yep.
One's complacent to sit there all day and study, and one can't stand still.
Okay, very good. And how did those differences come about?
Just, it's in the genes. It's there.
Jackie?
One wants to be more dominant than the other,
Okay.
and he will connive and work out ways to get a situation according to what he wants.
Okay.
He will do anything he wants, anything to get what he wants.
Okay. So Jacob has a goal, and let's say there are two ways, at least, of being rational. You can use your reason in order to discover the truth, or you can use your reason as an instrument for getting what you want. Let's call it inherent, I don't know what the right way to say it, but the second is instrumental reason. You're not looking for the truth, you're looking for gain. And Jacob is a master of instrumental truth. He knows what he wants, and he knows how to go about doing it. Okay? By the way, why are the boys the way they are? Jim says that they're different boys. Their parents favor them, right? Isaac is a person who loves game, and Esau's a hunter. And therefore he's going to favor Esau. Whereas Rebekah, although it doesn't come through here so much, is more thoughtful. And maybe it does come through in verse 22. But the children struggle in her womb, and she's sad. If so, why do I exist? She's reflecting on her situation. She's not like Isaac, I'm going to overstate it, whose goal is to fill his belly. But she's willing to step back from a situation and to scrutinize it and to ask questions. So that part of, we might say, the difference between the 2 boys has to do with how each parent dotes on one of them, cultivates his or her, this is something I think Candy used that a little earlier, that some of the predilections of a parent can be found in the children. And here is a good example of the role of parental favoritism. Each sees the other. Each sees the child as a mirror of him or herself, and therefore favors him. Esau loves to play basketball, and so does Isaac. How else did he learn how to love basketball than from a father who favored him? Harry?
I think a key difference is that, excuse me, Jacob is cerebral. He thinks. He is not a rough-hewn sort of person. And this is prophetic of the or I should ask the question, knowing what's to follow, that really the Jewish people historically have been a more cerebral people. And this goes on throughout history, that to this day, the Jews are considered, maybe despised, because they tend to be a cerebral people, namely be successful by their minds rather than by their farming or whatever you want to call it, by their hands.
So Harry is saying that in another way, Jacob is Israel. Jacob foreshadows one of the elements we attribute to the Jewish people. That is a sense of intelligence, practical intelligence. What are the barriers that stand in my way, and how do I circumvent them? So Jacob is the first Luftmensch. He's the first one to have his head in the air, thinking about how to accomplish certain tasks. By the way, just as an aside, this, according to some forms of Zionism at its beginning, is a way of describing the pathology of the Jewish people. That we have our heads in the air, and that a certain sense, and Pinsker, what was Pinsker's first name? Anybody remember? Is it Isaac Pinsker, who wrote a piece long before Theodor Herzl, something like 1885, called Auto-Emancipation. That we can't count on others to emancipate us. We have to do it ourselves. And what do we need emancipation from? What is the pathology of our situation? That we are, and he uses this term, we are ghosts in European history. That is, we're spirit without form, without substance that binds us to the more natural life. His idea, and the whole agrarian form of Zionism, was a way of trying to normalize the Jewish people by placing us there as farmers in order to get our fingernails under the soil, under our fingernails, and by being able to cultivate the earth, we lose our exclusive interest in ideas and literature and really become a normal people again. That's agrarian Zionism. In a certain way, it's built on the notion of the mysticism of the soil of the land of Israel. Cultivating the soil of the land of Israel is redemptive. So agrarian Zionism is a kind of mysticism, but unlike the mysticism we're familiar with, which is mysticism from above, agrarian Zionism is mysticism from below. We touch the really real when we dig in the soil. And this is a secular way of transforming mysticism into something about the land of Israel. So what Harry is saying, that we have been able to manage by our intelligence and we've had to, is taken by some to be precisely the aberrational part of the Jewish experience in Europe. Jordan?
Yeah, Rebecca's preference for Jacob is preordained. The Lord told her that the older shall serve the younger.
Yes.
And as they came out of the womb, she knew that the younger was the one who she should favor. So it was messed up by him from the beginning.
So that's an interesting point. So here, as in the Cain and Abel story, God's role, God intercedes in the natural process, and in a certain way destines the brothers to a certain kind of set of problems. Okay? Gosh, there's a lot to say about this. I mean, the older shall serve the brother. So once again, in this story, it happens in a story we passed over, Isaac and Ishmael, that the older child is supplanted by the younger child. The Bible is waging a polemic against the truth of primogeniture, that the firstborn is to be privileged. And the Bible explores this over and over again. King David is not the firstborn and so on. Or to put it differently, that nature is no certain guide of quality. That nature, the firstborn is nature's gift to the family. The firstborn comes first. And therefore, who is first, and so many societies feel this, who comes first is got a position of privilege in the family. When I've made out my will, I have 3 children. I did not ask myself which child is the best equipped to be my executor. I didn't ask that question. The only issue for me was to authorizing my oldest child. In other words, if I made a choice on the basis of who they are, this will create a poison among them. But we all accept, maybe I've overstated it, that there is something primary about the firstborn. And therefore, I didn't choose my firstborn because she happens to be more equipped to handle it than that this is a way of avoiding problems among siblings. So there is kind of a natural proclivity to favor in some way or another the firstborn. And the Bible is arguing against this. By the way, St. Paul in the New Testament does the same thing, that the firstborn is supplanted by the secondborn. Gary?
Yes, I think we're overlooking one point here.
Yeah.
And that is genetics. People have different tendencies that are natural tendencies, and I believe that these are genetically related. And I think, we have in Esau an outdoorsman, and we have in Jacob, as has been mentioned, a more sedate, thoughtful person. And I think that's really part of the thing here. And the other part here, and I take his point, is that, and the older shall serve the younger, is an indication perhaps of the lack of free will here. Perhaps God already has ordained what these two will do in their life. So that's a possibility.
Yeah, right. That's right. So again, God is entering the picture and making choices of God's own. We might call that foreordained. So what we're exploring here is the way in which individuals, as individuals and as part of a larger entity, a family, operate, and how the health and the pathologies of the families eventuates from the actions of the players. That's our assumption. Otherwise, it wouldn't be worth asking these questions. But we've noted now that that is not an adequate description of how to go about figuring out the nature of the relationships. There's also a kind of destiny factor, whether it's DNA or whether it's God. So what does this tell us? That we do have free will, but it has its limitations. That there are other factors beyond our choices, beyond our capacity to choose, that determine it already.
Beyond our understanding.
Right. And it raises a very interesting question. I'm going to just say something about one of my favorite authors here, and that is Leo Strauss. And Leo Strauss is interested in the difference between the ancients and the moderns. And he points out that the ancients had a sober view of what human beings can accomplish. That there is such a thing as chance, over which we have no control. There is the distribution of health and disease. There's war. So the ancients, according to Strauss, had a moderate view of what human beings can achieve. Okay? And he makes an interesting point. Those of you who have read Plato's Republic know that in the middle books, he creates a picture of a utopian society. And that has been criticized as being authoritarian. Karl Popper wrote a two-volume book called The Open Society and Its Enemies. Strauss's view is that Plato creates this picture of a utopian society to show how impossible utopian visions are. And that if we entertain and then try to implement utopian visions, we're going to fail because we don't have the control, the full control over our destiny that we might think we do. The moderns, on the other hand, and he's pointing to Machiavelli and Thomas Hobbes, felt that the problems of the human condition can be solved by human beings. And therefore they introduced a kind of utopian element into Western thought, of which the Enlightenment, what's the whole ideology of the Enlightenment? To bring light where there is darkness. To create the modern university where you have the ologies, the logic of sociology, psychology, anthropology, all of which have a kind of disciplinary logic, that if we pursue the logic of the discipline, we can solve the problems of society, of human beings, of culture. And so according to Strauss, the architects of the Enlightenment forgot what the ancients taught, that our capacity is limited. We can accomplish a lot. But if we get engaged in utopian speculations, we're going to create real problems. And for Strauss, the return in the 20th century of reactionary totalitarian governments emerges because the Enlightenment promised too much and was bound to fail. And in that failure, reactionary regimes that will have the dear leader who will take care of us as long as we accord that leader total control, is, according to Strauss, a reaction to the mistakes of the architects of the Enlightenment. And Strauss is therefore arguing for the superior wisdom of the ancients' view of what could be accomplished. And I think, to circle back, that seems to be a lesson as well of the Torah here. Because God's role becomes decisive, maybe imponderable, but that these families don't operate only on the basis of their own thoughts and impulses. There are other elements at work beyond the family's control. So I think Strauss might say that not only do the ancient Greeks have this view of the limited capacity to solve our problems, but so does Scripture, as another example of ancient wisdom. And maybe this is one of the implications of, let me put it this way, having a God in your system. Having a God in your system both enables the possibility of hope, but also limits what it is we can accomplish on our own. It's an interesting set of speculations that he engages in here. Russell?
Yeah, so on that, I think another element here is that God is learning and becoming better between the Cain and Abel story and the Jacob and Esau story, because here he doesn't talk to Esau. Vivian said Cain was his intimate. Here Rebecca is his intimate. So he approaches it before the boys are even born instead of after the fact. So
I got it. Thank you.
He's getting a jump on it to get successful.
I'm not sure. I'm not following your
So
point.
instead of in the first story, God talked to Cain, didn't work. Here he doesn't wait to talk to Esau. He talks to Rebecca before the babies are born, as Jordan said, to help get his vision of or his destiny going in the direction he wants to. So he's getting better at working with humans because he got in earlier in this situation between the two siblings and talked to the mother before they were born. And even more than that, go back that he helped Abraham's servant find Rebekah, anticipating she'll be needed for this. Am I being too cryptic?
Are you saying that God is becoming more intrusive?
No, he's getting better at his job.
By getting involved earlier.
Earlier.
Is that what you're saying?
And with the right person.
Although getting involved earlier suggests that God is limiting to some degree the free will of human beings. He's already determined something of the outcome.
He realizes we're going to botch it up, so he's got to be a little more proactive.
Wouldn't it be great if God could come in now and tell us how to solve the Hamas-Israel problem? So, is this a story of sibling rivalry? I think the tendency of our conversation in the last 10 or 15 minutes is less so because the individuals are less free. The parents have a role, don't they? The favoritism. And the proclivities of Jacob and Esau enabled Jacob to succeed, where Esau does not. So sibling rivalry here has something to do with both parental favoritism as well as the innate capacities of the individuals. And Jacob's capacities are highlighted in this situation, whereas he might not prevail in a very different situation. Okay? So Jacob is able to steal, you think that's too strong? The birthright. He takes advantage of Esau's hunger, being famished. I'm near death. So, yeah, Jackie?
This is a way out, but I usually go way out on the limbs, okay? Esau was born first.
Yep.
All right? The brother emerged holding on to the heel.
Yeah, yeah.
So baby is coming out, the feet are still there. Jacob is depending on his brother with the help of his brother to pull him out of the womb, which is kind of interesting. You know, instead of following naturally, the hand is all the way up here, holding on to a heel. I think he needs the help of his brother to emerge. But then it's kind of weird.
Another interpretation might be he's trying to supplant his brother to get out first, maybe to pull him back. You know that story of Peretz and Zerah later in Genesis 38, Tamar. One brother pulls the other back and gets born first. So, but you're saying that here is a way in which Jacob is not trying to supplant his brother, this is your interpretation, but depending on him to help him out. Okay? Hadn't thought of that. Is this a story of sibling rivalry? What do you think? Okay. How many think it is? How many think it isn't? Those who don't think it is, say something about it. Amy, would you like to say something?
Well, I think for me, there's an end goal here that Jacob has that really doesn't have anything to do with who else is around. He wants the primacy. And he kind of gets it, but there's a punishment because he got over on his father because his father couldn't see. You know, and then Leah and Rachel, he gets, somebody with weak eyes gets over on him and ends up being the bride he didn't expect.
That's punishment.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, but I think Esau's sort of an instrument to illustrate that in order to get where he wanted to go, you have to be above somebody else. Because you're not the boss of anybody if there's nobody to boss around.
So your point is that this is a story not so much about the dynamics of a relationship, but what Jacob wants. And Esau just happens to be the one in the way. Okay. On the other hand, just to put it out there, because I think it's an interesting point, they do come to reconcile with one another later, right? You remember, and we'll read this next week, that 20 plus years later, when Jacob's on his way back to the land of Israel, he hears that Esau is coming with 500 men. And Jacob is terrified. He doesn't know what Esau is planning. He sequesters his family and sends 400 lambs or whatever it is to appease Esau. So at least at that point, there is a feeling of ill will, as if this really is a sibling rivalry in which they're working together or not together at the beginning, created a dynamic which they now feel, or were made to feel, needs some rectification. In that sense, it is a sibling rivalry, right, that does linger. Even though, I mean, the point about God and the point about Jacob being so single-minded compromises the sense that this is truly a sibling rivalry story. Gary?
I have a different interpretation. I think that the two had an early parting of the ways based on the birthright. But they were basically different kinds of people. Esau went off, did his thing as a in the wilds, and Jacob, of course, continued his own studies and going that way. Yeah. I think that basically Jacob had a guilt about what he did to his brother, and basically at the end they were able to come together.
Yeah, that's very good. And by the way, this going off on his own continues in the next episode, where, remember, Isaac is on his deathbed, he's blind. Jacob has already gotten the birthright, but he doesn't yet have the blessing. And he and his mother, Rebekah, conspire to get it illicitly. So there again, it's not so much relationship between Jacob and Esau as who Jacob is in cooperation with who Rebekah is. Yeah. But Gary raises the question of the guilt, which Jacob definitely has. So even though he's single-minded in what he wants, he does have some remorse about the way in which he's treated his brother. We'll have to think about this more. Jim?
Well, but they're kind of complementary personalities, and it's really too bad they just didn't work together, because neither one's personality negated the other one.
Yeah.
I think what I'm saying is Jacob didn't have to push his brother out of the way to proceed. He could have conspired with him. And based on what we know, I don't think Esau would have said, get out of the way, I'm going to do whatever. He was happy with his life.
Who was?
Esau. Jacob doesn't seem to be, he's so busy conniving. I don't know if he was a happy person. He's always trying to put one over on somebody. He's like Jacob's the car salesman and Esau's the mechanic in the back fixing the thing. I mean, Esau seems like a much more calm person, even though he's a very active person.
Well, it raises the question whether or not, I mean, if Jacob just said, I'm going to work with Esau, Esau would still be in possession of the birthright and therefore be the leader of the family, which the Torah is suggesting would not be a good thing, because Esau doesn't have the capacity. Esau is about filling his belly, about material, physical well-being. And if you're going to carry the covenant in difficult, challenging circumstances, you do need a more Jacob kind of guy who is really willing to face the difficulties and find a way. So working together wouldn't have solved the birthright problem, and therefore the leadership of the family.
Well, they could have agreed on that. I'm saying, what if?
Yeah.
It may have all come out the same anyway, but
Yeah.
I don't see, based on the personalities, why they couldn't have worked together.
Right.
But I
And
also
why
think
couldn't-
they had the gift of hindsight. When Cain kills Abel, it's almost immediate. When you look at something from 20 years later,
Yes?
maybe Esau said, well, maybe this wasn't totally kosher, but it worked out for the best. And in order to appease him, Jacob does what he did in the first place. He gives him something to eat.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. There's that famous moment when Esau and Jacob finally, 20 years, meet up, and what happens? Esau puts his arm around Jacob and kisses him, and in the Torah scroll, that word for kiss has dots over it. It's called nakudot. There are like 18 instances in the Torah of dots. We don't know exactly, and they're in the Torah scroll, which doesn't have vowels and so on. And the rabbis translate nashika, kiss, as nashicha, to bite. And so those dots indicate that the rabbis don't believe it. That Esau kissed, that really, when he put his arm around him, he bit his neck. So that the rabbis can't believe that Esau is willing to reconcile. That's a moment of reconciliation which the rabbi's interpretation subverts. So yes, there is a way in which they do come back together and heal their relationship, which presupposes something broken in the relationship. So that, we do see how this may not be as fully a sibling rivalry story as Cain and Abel or as Joseph and his brothers, but it has sibling rivalry components. Okay, Eileen?
I just have a comment. I think this is a case of parental rivalry as opposed to sibling rivalry. The parents, Isaac and Rebecca, they had their favorites, and as good parents, they should have been able to show to their children that they love them equally.
Yeah.
I identify with this story. I have a set of twins. One came out first bigger, then the second one smaller. And, as a parent, I and their father tried to show them that we love them equally, even though they were entirely different.
Yeah.
So this to me is parental rivalry.
Well, there isn't, of course, that would be great, except, let me just point out one factor and then we'll stop. So, there are 12 chapters devoted to Abraham. There are 25 chapters devoted to Jacob. There's only one chapter devoted to Isaac. Well, that's chapter 26. He just has one set of episodes relating to him, and fundamentally, though Abraham migrates from the land of Israel and comes back, and Jacob migrates and then his children come back, Isaac stays in the land of Israel. This is something for which he is lauded. But when you think about it, what's the image of Isaac that we have? Lying down. He's taken up to Mount Moriah, laid down on the mountain, and strapped to the pyre. In the story we're now looking at, most of this story, he's in bed saying, I'm near death. It turns out that he lives another many, many years. But he thinks of it, so Isaac is an extremely passive person. If you think about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Abraham is huge, Jacob is huge, Isaac isn't huge, but we might say there's a role for the non-huge link in a chain, who is a token of continuity we don't get from Abraham to Jacob without going through Isaac, who's very different. So the question I'm raising here by saying this is, what if Isaac and Rebekah had a better relationship and agreed that they were going to treat both boys the same, and they grew up And there's this constant tension between Jacob, who wants the birthright. He feels that he is the person to lead the family, to put the best face on it. And Esau wants it too. And let's suppose they decided in old age that they would share it. I mean, do you get enough strength, forward-lookingness, resilience, perseverance? Jacob is your perseverance guy. He says to Pharaoh at the very end when he's brought down by Joseph, "Few and evil have been the days and years of my life," but there he is. He's made it to the other side. So the parents getting along better, which would be wonderful for them and maybe for the family. I mean, the dinner table will be a happier place. But the Jewish people's future would be imperiled. Because, I'm going to quote Rabbi Leo DeRocher, "Nice guys finish last." Or Vince Lombardi, "Winning isn't one thing. Winning is the only thing." Now, that's very Machiavellian, but do you need some Machiavellian individual who's intent on keeping the story going, even though he's going to face a lot of obstacles? Jacob's the right person and Esau's not. And if they got along better, they would share the glory. Would that have been good? It just raised that question. Yeah, there's a cost here to strife within the family circle. There's definitely a cost. But
What
Maybe.
would have happened, and I understand why it doesn't, but what would have happened if the firstborn in any of these stories had been a woman, a girl?
Yeah.
It changes the whole complexion of every
Right. I don't know. I mean, we'd have to now think about it, but there are certainly a number of women, firstborn or not, who manage the situation and bring it to a more felicitous conclusion. I mean, Tamar and the Tamar and Judah story, and Ruth and Esther and Hannah and Miriam and so on.
But Miriam did, although she may have been the firstborn, did not get to be the leader of the people.
She just saved the leader.
Right. So it's a patriarchal society, there's no doubt about it. But there are some women who turn out to be leaders. Yeah, right. Okay, we'll continue next week. Shabbat Shalom.
We're still alive. I made my middle son my executor because he was competent. And no, the first one knew it wasn't his kind of whalehouse. What?
You were lucky in that regard. It might have been, and he said, why not me?
Hey, I'm going to be gone. And it was my coach who said winning is everything. Did you say it was DeRocher? Did you say it was DeRocher?
No, I think it was Vince Lombardi.
Well, our football coach was Lou Little. He said winning isn't everything. And my fencing coach said winning is everything.
Could they be quoting Vince Lombardi? Yeah, really. I mean, this probably has existed for all of this kind of thinking. Yeah.
We will win.
Yeah. And we need coaches like that. Bobby Knight just died.
He was a son of a gun. He was a nasty man. He was a nasty man. Mean, nasty man. I had a run-in with Bobby Knight because I was teaching at Indiana University, and I had one of his leading players. But I flunked him because he didn't come to class and didn't turn in his work. And Bobby Knight came in and was fuming mad and took me to the president of the university.
He did what?
Took me to the president of the university, and I showed the president of the university my books, and he said, "She's right." And he said, "What do you mean she's right?" He can't play if he doesn't pass this course. I said, then tell me to do his work. Oh, he was so awful. He was terrible.
He was, yeah. What year was this?
1970.
The 70s.
76 or 7. He was a son of a gun.
He really was. Well, famously he threw that chair across the floor.
Well, he almost hit me.
You were there?
No, he almost hit me this way. Two things. One, I think the man's, Pitzker's name was Leon, maybe?
You're right.
Okay.
Good for you.
Okay.
Leon Pitzer. Leo. Yeah,
Leon.
Good.
And I wanted to apologize. I left yesterday when you started doing the prayers after your sermon because I was in such pain I could not sit any longer, and I'm sure you saw me get up and leave, and I apologize.
Thank you. Never necessary.
Well, I was in extraordinary pain.
That's too bad.
People
get up and leave and come.
Well, and tomorrow you're doing the book club reading and discussion?
That's the week from tomorrow.
Oh, thank God, because I can't go tomorrow. Oh, I'm so glad. Thank you. Have a good week.
Two things. Hi. One, this is my last yes. Be with you. He says that Henry is Thank you.
It doesn't say that he did or did not. But I would have to make up for it. I mean, I'd have to because why would you like that little sheet when you like the hard work that I have to do growing up? I mean, that's a lot of hard work. Yes. Then you would lose. I know, I lose the story. Well, how real is it that God is involved anyway? Amen. Amen. Okay, you win. I've been trying very hard to understand why God did not accept the hard work of toiling in the soil.
Where were you in this?